Hi, I'm Ruth Molman with the Farmington Hills Historic District Commission, and I am here with John Williard, who is the chairman of the Farmington Hills Historic Commission. And he's a past president of the Historical Society, and he has done a lot of research and writing. He researched the Wixom Inn. He updated the 1867 Farmington section of the Oakland County history so that it's indexed and people that are doing research can really use that index. It's wonderful. And the latest thing that John has done is the book on the Garfield family. And we'll tell you, he will tell us how he got into the history of the Garfield family and how it is so significant for Farmington Hills. John?
Okay, thank you, Ruth. As you may recall, I moved here in 1980, wanting to get into an old house, and started to research the history of the house that I was in, going through the land records, and I noticed that one of the early purchasers was a man by the name of John Garfield. And research following up later on caused me to believe that he was the man who built the house. And from there, the house was designated with that name, and I decided that I would find out as much as I could about the history of the family. So really, from the early 80s until today, because it's ongoing every day, I have been working in research with the Garfield family members and through all of the records that are available to any genealogical researcher. I had a few breaks along the way, though, I must say. Two in particular. One time my house was on a home tour, you might remember those, and I was sitting home one day and I got a phone call, and a guy on the other end of the line said, "Hi, I'm John Garfield, you're living in my house." And so following up to that, of course, he was being a little humorous. I got introduced to a Henry Garfield, who was in his part of the Garfield family, who were the part of the Ohio Garfields. And Henry Garfield gave me a great deal of information about the family, which helped a lot in my early research. And then, a couple, 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, it's hard to say, one day we got a letter in the mail, and the woman writing the letter said, would you be interested in having pictures of John and Mary Garfield? And of course, we'd been searching for them and information about them for so many years, we couldn't believe a picture existed of them. And sure enough, they sent us a picture. That was Jane Paulisa, and Jane is the co-author on this monograph. And Jane gave a great deal of information as well. We put our heads together and we came up with the information that's in this monograph.
John, going through the monograph and the Garfield family, it gives us some history of what it was like for the various pioneer families coming out here. That's why this is so significant for Farmington.
Exactly. My feeling is not that their particular history is something we should all study, but that it's sort of the history of almost any family that came to this area in that time period. It starts actually in England, and the first Garfield came over in the early 1600s on the Arabella, settled in Boston area, lived there for 4 generations, and then when land got to be kind of expensive, they started relocating and relocating. In 1927, the National Genealogical Society magazine had an article about the Garfields, and they said that in 1927, every Garfield in the United States was the descendant of that original Garfield, that there had been no other people that had with the Garfield name that had come over, which I thought was very interesting. And so anyway, following the movements of their family, I have a little map in here that shows the movements that the family went through, from the Boston area to Shrewsbury to New Hampshire to a place called Palatine Bridge in New York, then to the Finger Lakes area of New York, a couple of different locations, settling into one location, and then from there to Michigan. And it's very interesting to see the connections that happened along the way. For instance, John Garfield, the builder of my house, was born in New Hampshire when the family was there. His sister married Laura Garfield, met and married Halstead, David Halstead. I'm sorry, I can't remember the first name. Met her husband, who was a Halstead, in Palatine Bridge. Also, another Garfield female met Gages, and they got married, and the Gages are very prominent in this area, later in the 19th century being very prominent in Novi.
It's very interesting how they would come out in groups. One relative would know the other, and of course the Halstead Road,
Right,
and the Halstead did an awful lot. They were, of course, were Apple people
right.
here in
But the
Farmington.
Halsteads were Garfield related, you know, from before they came to Farmington. And then there were some intermarriages that happened once they were here, of course. And it's very interesting to see how they picked up various family members along the way at their different stops. One of the earlier people to migrate to new areas in this branch of the Garfields was a man by the name of Welcome Garfield. Welcome Garfield was the first one to move to the Finger Lakes area. The first place that he settled in about 1809 was the area where all of the other people from Farmington actually came from when they left to come here. You know, the Power family and all those people were all neighbors of his. And we feel that that's how the Garfields came to come here, was through that association, even though they moved a little bit further west in New York before coming here.
The Powers were friends of or related to the Garfields.
I can't document any of that. All I know is they lived very close to one another. I can only assume they knew each other in some way or another. Because in 1824, when the Powers came here, Orrin Garfield is one of the first people to move here, and came here. It's in the 1877 history of Oakland County, and lived here then from then on until eventually he moved in the 1870s to Holly, where a lot of the family had settled.
The ministers that the Baptist ministers that the Garfields became involved with, did they move to Holly or did they move somewhere else?
Well, they seemed to have a very close relationship with the Lambs, Eriswell Lamb, as I recall in particular. But there is the church records from North Darien Baptist Church, and William Garfield, John Garfield's brother, was the deacon of that church and stayed in New York, never did come to Michigan. But if you look in the early church records from that, you'll find many of the people that we know from the Farmington area, all as members of that church there in North Darien Baptist Church in New York. So there's all these connections, all, you know, as I say, in all of the different places where they lived. And then when they got here, of course, they were very closely associated with the Baptist Church. They were all Baptists, and the Lambs in particular, who were the Baptist ministers at the time. The Garfields were involved in buying the land in 1842 that became the Baptist Cemetery, or the West Farmington Cemetery as we know it today. And then in about 1840, there was a movement from here to the Heartland area.
Oh, it's Heartland rather than Holly.
And that's where the Lambs, some of the Lambs moved at that time. And in fact, John Garfield and his wife Mary are buried in the Parshallville Baptist Cemetery there in that area. They did move after that to Fentonville, where John bought a retirement home and lived there for a while. And then after he died, he was buried next to his wife, who died in 1862. So it's an interesting story. There's a lot of heartache and difficulty along the way. When many of the family members were moving to Michigan, a few of the family members skipped Michigan and went to Wisconsin. That was Samuel Garfield, and two of his sisters with their families moved there, and they were living in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. And then Samuel Garfield was a nephew of John Garfield's, was the son of his brother William. William's wife, Samuel's mother, came for a visit in 1856 to Wisconsin. During that visit, his mother and her two sisters, the wives of the family members that were living in that area all died at the same time.
Wow. From
So
what?
we think they must have had some sort of a disease that they all had by mutual contact, and they all died there. And 2 years later, in 1858, Samuel Garfield decided that he was going to visit another one of his sisters who was living in Grand Rapids. And along the way, they took the stagecoach with his son Charles, and along the way around Kalamazoo area or something like that, the stagecoach made a stop, and the stagecoach driver directed all of the people on board to come over and take a look at this tree that he thought was significant. And so they took him over to the side of this 10-foot diameter black walnut tree,
Wow.
which was a huge tree. And Samuel turned to his 10-year-old son Charles and he said, "Son, take off your hat. You're in the presence of nobility."
Oh, is that a
And
wonderful story?
that set his life path. On Charles's tombstone, it says, "Useful citizen, lover of trees."
Mm.
And Samuel went on to Grand Rapids, loved it there, moved there. Charles, of course, and the rest of his family moved there with him. They founded the First National Bank of Grand Rapids. Their homestead became Garfield Park, which is still there today. And Charles Garfield became very involved in the nature movement. They witnessed the great forests of Michigan being clear-cut to rebuild Chicago after the Chicago fire. They thought this was terrible. There was a lot of waste. They were just burning smaller forested areas to get to the bigger trees, and laid waste a lot of Michigan. Anyway, through the work of Charles Garfield, he is credited with single-handedly reforesting all of Michigan. He worked with Fred Warner when Fred Warner was governor, and became the first head of what would now be the DNR. And they set aside a reserve for trees and so on. So that all came through the Garfield family out of Grand Rapids.
Were the Garfields involved in the Civil War? I know a lot of
absolutely.
the West Farmington people. That's where the church was. Well,
there was one of the
very
Garfield,
active.
one of the Garfield descendants, women married a Gage, and the Gages had a member who is buried in West Farmington Cemetery who fought and died in the Civil War. There are a number of others from the Rose, Michigan, Rose Township area, Garfields from that area, Marshall Garfield, who fought in the Civil War. In fact, his picture's in the book.
They were the most, that West Farmington group were very, very strong for the Civil War, and they were very, very fierce fighters, I understand.
Yes,
So
there's
we
quite a
have,
number of people in the extended family that fought in the war. And Jane's ancestor, she's a direct descendant of William Garfield, John Garfield's brother. And William was the deacon of the North Darien Baptist Church in New York. When they were moving to Rose Township, when they were settling there, they were traveling by wagon, probably some sort of a covered wagon, I would guess, up the corduroy roads. In a particularly rough stretch of road, the wagon shook so much that their young baby girl, Aminta was her name, fell out of the back of the wagon and broke her neck and died.
Oh, how awful.
And they had to bury her alongside the road on the way to their home. So it's these kind of tragedies that happened to all families that were doing the pioneering of the Michigan area. And as I said earlier, I think that's the importance of this. This shows what all of these pioneers went through, the trials and tribulations that they went through in getting to their new homes. And it was very, very difficult road to travel.
And they carried through their religious feelings and the other things that they did in the farming. What kind of farming did they do generally, do you know?
I'm not particularly knowledgeable in that area, but I think it would be, typically though, they would start off with subsistence farming for the first couple of years, and then once they could generate some surpluses, then they would take their crops to market in the Detroit area. Exactly what they grew, I don't know. I know in mid-19th century, a lot of them went into dairy farming, and then towards the end of the 19th century, they were what they were called fruit farming. They set up orchards and so on and did a lot of fruit farming. So that's kind of the progression that happened to most families in the Farmington Hills and Michigan area.
Yes, fruit farming was big. Apples particularly were,
Yes.
they shipped a lot of them all over the world, I understand. And
Well, one of the things I wanted to point out is in the center piece of this particular monograph, I created a map which includes Farmington Township as well as Novi Township. And it shows all of the early land transactions that involve Garfields, purchases and sales. And you can see that at one point, there were enough Garfields here that their land was formed a swath through the northwest part of the township, and you could go from almost 14 Mile and Drake Road all the way down to 12 Mile and Haggerty just about, and never step off of Garfield land.
Wow.
So it was a lot more extensive than people realize.
They probably visited back and forth too, considerably.
Certainly.
And I guess some of the early farmers used to share labor, I understand. That's one of the things they did.
Well, one of the things that I realized that when John Garfield bought his property from the Pettibones, they were actually relatives of his at the time. I didn't realize it initially, but the Pettibones are intermarried with Garfields. When he sold his property to the Halsteads, that was another relative of his. So a lot of these transactions and a lot of the things that they did were among friends and relatives in those early communities.
Yes, very, very, very interesting. So by tracing the family, we can trace our history. Didn't they have a president along the way too?
Very important. Yeah, two very noteworthy members of this family are James A. Garfield, the president from 1881, who died in office, and then Brigham Young.
Brigham Young
is also, yes, a descendant from the Garfield family.
I don't know. They weren't into Mormonism.
Well, it was a part of the family which branched off from females marrying other people and so on. So you get away from the Garfield name, and then ultimately away from the Baptist religion and into other religions. So.
Yeah. That's very interesting that people from this group, strong Baptists, would become Mormons. That's really. Were the women, were they one of numbers of wives, or were they just single wives to these people?
That I don't know. Yeah, it's been a long and difficult road to get this information, and it's never really done, as you know.
Yes.
But it was a lot of fun doing it. Jane was a huge amount of help, and she provided all the pictures, the historical pictures that are in the monograph came from her and through her family connections.
John, can you tell me where you can get the book on the Garfield family and some of the other things you've done?
Okay, well, it's not on Amazon, I can tell you that. But if you know where the Farmington Heritage and History Center is located, which is near the stables here in Heritage Park area, Brian Golden is operating that facility for the city. And a number of the publications, including this one, are available there to either look at or purchase, whatever. We sell them for the printing costs.
To branch off a little bit, I think you have some interesting ties to this Farmington area. I think, didn't you fly in here with your father as a young boy?
Oh, yes. Yeah, a totally different topic. My dad always loved airplanes and flying, and was in World War II as a sailor. But before the war, he got his pilot's license, and he worked for Stinson Aircraft. So he had a long association with airplanes. After the war, he wanted to have his own plane, and he bought a small two-place airplane, and then later had a couple of other different planes, a little bit larger. In those days, and I think they still do it today, they had what they called fly-ins. And the pilots would get together, I think, on a monthly basis, and they would pick some airport, some local small grass field type airport in those days. You would all fly in and have a breakfast, a fly-in breakfast. And so all of the different pilots would all fly into an airport, and they would land, and they would have a pancake breakfast and chew the fat for a while and look at each other's planes and take off and go home. And I went with him on many of those in this area, but I particularly remember landing in Farmington Field, which was Crisport, on 13 Mile and Orchard Lake Road. I remember walking through the building and coming out the door that everybody would normally go in, at the front of the building, and looking around. Of course, I was just a young kid, and there wasn't a lot to see at that point. A lot of trees and dirt roads and things, but it was kind of a fun experience. I do remember having a fly-in breakfast in this airport, And now the airport is all but forgotten, except for a few of us that try to keep the memory of that going.
Well, they have the terminal. I guess it never was a terminal that people came to, but the terminal there. And if you look at Orchard Lake Road there, you could see where the hangars were.
Yes. Yeah, that building had airplanes in it that would be parked. Basically, in those days, the main building would have a hangar area, and if you had more money, you would have your airplane parked in there. Usually the bigger, more expensive planes were parked in there. Everybody else had theirs tied out in the field to stakes that were in the ground just over grass. That's what my dad always did. And so you would come into that building, and that's where the breakfasts were held. And then up in the front there would be an area probably about the size of this room where there might be a couple of people sitting at desks that you would have to pay a landing fee. When you go to those small airports, it might be $1 or something like that. But you had to pay the landing fee to land there. And then if you needed gasoline, that's where you would go to try to find somebody that could get the gas truck over and fill your airplane up. So
They had to tie them down. That fascinated me. Otherwise, I guess your plane would take off by itself.
well, they would have these metal iron rings that would be in cement in the ground, and then there were tie downs on the airplane, and you would tie your plane down because in heavy wind and so on, it would be damaged, could be damaged.
And then you had another experience with Farmington in finding your house.
Oh, well, that's a long story. But
Do you want to tell me about it?
well, in the 60s, I was traveling with a group of friends to find a place to cut down our own Christmas tree. And one of my friends was driving, and he had located a place that was a big thing to do at the time, and there was a thing in the Detroit News showing maps of all the places you could go to. So on the day we were going to travel, we took off, and as we were traveling, I wasn't paying a great deal of attention. I was just talking in the back seat, and at one point I happened to look out the window, and we passed by a road sign that said Drake Road. And I thought not too much of it. I just happened to remember the name. And then after that, we were climbing a hill. We were in a very heavily wooded area. And as I looked off to the right, I saw an old house there. And I said, gee, wouldn't it be nice to live there in this forest and way away from civilization where you could enjoy life, as nature. And anyway, later on in 1980, when I was looking to move to an old house, a real estate agent and I had the same experience. He was driving, and we passed the same Drake Road sign and went up the same hill, and that took me right to the same house, so I knew I had to buy that house. So that's where I live today.
And you have done a wonderful job of redoing that house.
Well, it's been a labor of love, and it's very time-consuming and detail-oriented, but thank you very much, yes.
Yeah, you're very exacting being an engineer. Most of us are not. You redid the windows, I believe, because it took out the 20s windows and put in the...
The house had been greatly revamped in 1917 when the Tuttles bought the place. In fact, I talked to somebody who lived across the street at the time, and she told me that they owned the house for 4 or 5 months and worked on it solid before moving in. And she said before that it was just an old farmhouse. It was her exact words. And when I bought the house, it had oak floors on top of the original floors. Walls had been moved around, windows had been moved, load-bearing walls had been removed, the roof was caving in. There was a lot of work to be done. And when I took the oak flooring off, the original flooring was underneath, and all of the paint marks from the original walls were there, so I was able to put everything back. And inside the walls, they had cut up the wood that had been the baseboard and window trim and all that sort of thing, and they used it as bracing inside the walls. So with that, I had original pieces of wood to follow and was able to put everything back on the original paint marks. So it's been a very meticulous restoration, as you said.
You've done a beautiful job. It's a great thing to look at, and you've done so much for Farmington Hills. We can be very proud of the things you've done.
Well, thank you very much.
And thank you for coming to
It's my pleasure.
talk with us.